Yep.
Excellent. I think, sorry to the people on Zoom, I think what happens is as we're setting up out here, they hear it in there and go, oh, no, we need to turn that to mute, and then they mute me, which they should not do. But we're unmuted now, so hopefully you can hear us. So the toilets are in the corner of the room, and the books, there's a stack of books at the front counter if you haven't already got that. There will be a signing afterwards. We'll just move a table inside and we'll have a signing and a time to chat a little bit more informally afterwards, which is really great. I think that's all the information that I need to give you. If you are in the room and have your mobile phone on you, if you could turn to silent, that would be awesome as well. So for the people on Zoom, we are zooming out live tonight, but we will also be uploading this to YouTube. So in a week or so's time, anybody from here, if you want to risk seeing yourself read in the flesh on our Zoom link, that will be available in a week to have a look at and to traumatise yourself with. Because tonight is a Salon event and we have 3 readers reading up front of this event. So to kick us off, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on in this area, the Yagara and the Turrbal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. And because we're on Zoom, we are zooming out onto many different Aboriginal lands, and I would like to pay my respects to elders of the lands that you're zooming in from. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So tonight we have one of my very favourite forms of events, which is our Salon Events. These are events where we introduce you to 3 emerging writers who will read for 3 minutes from their own work. This has been an event that we have been running for a few years now. It's been awarded from the Australian Booksellers Association as one of the most innovative forms of events, and it also has launched readers who have then gone on to publish their own books. And we have had many books that have come out of the readers who have read at our Salon Events. So we look forward to reading the published books of the readers that we have here tonight. So I'd like to introduce you first to our first reader, who is Amanda Leigh. Monologues for acting in Amanda's age were difficult to find, so she wrote her own. The characters in Teacher's Pet came to life. She attended the Faber How to Write a Novel workshop in 2021 and completed Teacher's Pet in her spare time. Amanda is a taxi for 3 children and runs a business with her husband. She prefers writing and it's a lot more fun. So everybody please welcome Amanda. At least it's low for you there.
Still never low enough. Hi. This is an excerpt towards the end of the book where, anyway. Do something. Natasha grabbed the handle and held on. Darcy needed a weapon, something that might hurt Karen or slow her down. She emptied her pockets. The lipstick went first, followed by a tampon across the roof. Both missed. The lipstick rolled off and disappeared under the car. The tampon made it halfway, stopped and spun slowly. Darcy looked in the gutter again. There was nothing. She noticed her shoes. She had a weapon. She was wearing it. 3 days old, barely any scratches on the soles, and a steel-tipped stiletto. That would hurt. She whipped off a shoe and cradled it. Darcy sent a mental apology to the designer and hesitated. She couldn't do it. Manolos were meant to be admired and loved, not lobbed at the head of a lollipop lady holding a butcher's knife. Karen gained traction on the door. She angled the blade and stabbed it into the gap. Darcy! Natasha screamed and ducked to avoid the knife. She had hold of the door handle and Kristen had hold of her. Arm raised, Darcy closed her eyes and threw as hard as she could. The shoe, an unguided missile, would heal first. Karen didn't see it coming until it was too late. She let go of the door and brought the knife up as a shield. The shoe missed the blade and kept going. The metal spike embedded in Karen's cheek. It wobbled on impact. Karen gasped, and blood spotted her lips. Darcy squeezed open one eye. She reeled backwards at the sight of her shoe deep in Karen's cheek. Karen opened her mouth to scream. A bubbly gasp hissed from her lips. She blinked in confusion at Natasha's face squashed against the window. Her knees buckled, the knife slipped from her fingers, and she hit the ground face first. Hands caught the air and knocked the shoe. The scream escaped, a wet, lingering wail of pain. Karen tugged the shoe free. The stiletto heel released with a sucking sound. Blood followed, a waterfall of crimson. Karen collapsed, face first onto the grass. Darcy gagged. Annabella freed herself from the stab vest. Nice throw, she congratulated. Darcy recovered quickly. Where did you think Kristina's sporting ability came from? I can never tell if you're being serious or not. Annabella dumped the stab vest. She must have got past the cops. Do you think she killed them? Natasha fell onto the grass. Kristen followed with help. Maybe, Annabella gave it some thought. Probably. It's a definite possibility. She approached the comatose Karen and kicked her foot. She checked out the wound. It was impressive. Annabella decided it was a lucky shot. It was the only explanation. She called over her shoulder. I'm going to check the house, see if the detectives are dead. Stay here and keep an eye on Karen. She reached the front door and took a deep breath. I'm going in. The house swallowed her up. In the distance, the school bell rang. Natasha sprang into action. I have to get Mason and Margot. She scraped her hair back and adjusted her clothing. Let's go. Kristen agreed. Beth? Her knees buckled and white spots peppered her vision. I don't think that. Natasha grabbed Kristen by the arm and dragged her up the hill. Kristen whimpered and gave in. She could see a doctor later. People live with broken ribs all the time, didn't they? You can't leave me alone here with her. Darcy watched Karen for signs of movement. What if she wakes up? You've got another shoe. Natasha didn't look back. They're Manolos. We've got plenty of others. Natasha pulled over her shoulder. You have no respect, said Darcy.
I love hearing these works. Sorry, totally. It's wonderful. The one thing that connects all our readers today, and in fact all of our writers today, is Kristina Olsson, who is the key figure in all of our lives, being a mentor and a fellow writer who has worked with so many of us to make our work better. So I thank Kristina for introducing me to all these emerging writers with the Faber Academy. Our second reader today is Jean Taylor. Jean is a retired teacher. A master's in creative writing at the University of Queensland had its genesis in the family stories passed down from her Finnish grandmother, and she is now using the material to write a memoir come family novel. Jean was a student in Chris Olsson's Faber Academy novel writing course in 2021 and is soon to commence the Memoir Express course at Abbott with Chris as well. And what a fantastic connection we have to tonight's story with Jean. So welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Chrissy. This piece is about my Finnish grandmother Esther and my mother Eva. Esther was born in 1903 and lived through the Finnish Civil War of 1918 and the invasion of Finland by Russia during the Second World War. My mother Eva was her only child. In the cold Finnish winter of 1929, Esther Hautaniemi, aged 28, cut herself out of her family photographs, and then she destroyed the severed images of herself. While tendrils of chilly November mist curled around the snug weatherboard house, Esther sat at the kitchen table and examined the postcard-sized images of herself, her husband, and their daughter, who sat between them. They were formal photographs, done at the local studio and quite expensive by the standards of the day, but still she cut them up, using a sharp pair of scissors to take herself out of the picture. She was earnest in her task, cutting precisely around the figure of her 2-year-old daughter Eva. And when it was done, she took the images of herself and threw them into the wood stove in the kitchen. As the flames caught hold, they obliterated the evidence of her discomfort in the photographer's studio, facing the all-seeing lens of the camera. I know this happened, or something very like it, because I've seen the cut-up photos of my mother Eva and my grandfather Uri. When I first saw them, Mum and I were looking through a box of her old family photos. I was startled when I saw the fragments, and I immediately wanted to know why Esther had cut herself out. The separate images show 2-year-old Eva looking solemnly at the camera, and Esther's husband, Rio, who looks pensively off to one side. Cut adrift from the complete portrait, they look unnatural, especially the pictures of Eva, of which there is more than one version. Esther had made different attempts to excise all traces of herself by carefully cutting around her shoulders, leaving Eva marooned within a series of odd curves and angles. But decades later, Mum still had them stored dutifully with all the other photos taken during her childhood and youth in rural Finland. She hated the photo, Mum said, as an explanation for her mother's actions. She said she looked terrible in it. I doubted this was true and wondered, naively, how she could think so little of herself. I'd seen family snapshots of my grandmother when young, and although she was often looking at the ground instead of the camera, still I could see that physically she was very beautiful. Had she been caught scowling at the camera, maybe? Unlikely. There would have been more than one shot taken, more than one portrait to choose from. Was she dissatisfied with her grooming, perhaps? No, there had to be more to it than that. Rio and Eva were respectively combed and starched, crimped and gloriously beribboned, and no doubt Esther would also have been dressed in her best for the occasion. I will never know the intricacies of Esther's feelings, but there is a poignance to the preserved images that is touching, both for what they reveal about the absent figure, as well as the images she chose to save. And it is the sad little sleeping fragments of Esther's family photos that first prompted my question, what happened to my grandmother in Finland that made her feel that she didn't belong?
Oh. Oh my gosh, Chris, you've got some good material to work with this term, I think. I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of that book. What a beginning. Our third reader today is John Richards, who has previously lived in Manchester and London and Singapore. He now lives in Brisbane with his wife and 4 children. In a previous life, he was a lawyer. He was shortlisted for the ABR Elizabeth Jolly Short Story Prize in 2021 for A Fall from Grace. Everybody welcome John Richards.
So I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs from a short story. The short story is called The Wolf Boy of Rugianto. In February 1266, in the village of Rugianto, located in the Ossa Valley of the Italian Alps, a 10-year-old boy, name unknown, was charged for taking on the form of a wolf and killing and partly devouring an Alpina goat, a lamb, and old Sidolato's Alsatian. The village community entertained little doubt of the boy's guilt. They had all heard repeatedly, and not just in the fog of Joko's taverna, Tronto the shepherd's account. Between Matin and Lords, on the feast day of Saints Alpi and Conda, beneath the night sky of black damask, pinpricked by the celestial blaze, and woven with wisps of phosphorescence, he had discovered in the frozen lower field by the river, surrounded by the steaming carcasses of beasts it had eviscerated, a wolf. It was like on its side, whimpering in pain, with reinforcements and ropes. The stricken wolf had disappeared, and its place taken by a skinny, naked, sleeping boy, shivering in the frost. His mouth was smeared with blood, and strips of sheep flesh were caught between his teeth, but there was no wound to his hands or feet. He seemed incapable, absent his metamorphosis,
I think we are back.
Understood by everyone.
I think we are back. I'll just move to the right area. Hello, everyone. I think we're back. I'm really hoping that the people online can hear me now. Sorry about the technical delay, but I think we're back on track. Great. So we'll get you guys up. Excellent. And I'd like to start by congratulating those three readers on such great work. So thank you, everybody. Formidable, the people that you have in your classes, Chris. Formidable. Crazy. So the conversation that we have today is with Emily Brugman, and we'd like to first welcome Emily into the family of published writers. We have a bit of a tradition in Brisbane of kind of claiming everybody within Cooey as members of the Brisbane Literary Mafia. And now that you've read here, you've done your launch here, I think that we can consider you officially part of the crew. So welcome. One of us says Mirandi. Emily has just come straight from a very traumatic event where her town was completely submerged by mud, and including her house. So we are glad that we can provide her with a slightly dried out area to be in just for a couple of days. So welcome. Emily Brugman is the granddaughter of Finnish Australian man Auno. How do you say that?
Hetmanni.
Okay. I am just going to believe her on that one. Who himself fished the islands with his family in the 1960s and later lived in Canberra for many decades. Research for this novel included interviews with Emily's grandfather and other Finns and their descendants who knew the Abrolhos Islands, some of whom still chase crayfish in the region today. Although a fictional account, the book captures the essence of a migratory path which many Finnish people took in the mid-20th century and which, given the relatively small size of the community, is not well known to many other Australians. An earlier version of the manuscript was shortlisted for the Australian Vogel Literary Award, and Emily is now working in Byron Bay as the program director of the Writers' Festival there. So welcome to Emily. And of course, in conversation with Emily is Queen of the Brisbane Literary Mafia, Kristina Olsson, who is a journalist and award-winning author of the novels Shell, In One's Skin and The China Garden, and two works of non-fiction, Boy Lost, a family memoir, and Kilroy Was Here. She is of Swedish and Australian descent, neighbours to the Finnish community in the book. So we have a little bit of a kind of a move to that area of the world tonight. Please welcome Kristina.
Can you hear me?
No, that's okay.
Now it's on. No.
Yes.
And thanks everyone for coming. Lovely to see all your smiles faces. Can I just say how bloody amazing those readings were?
Okay.
Just extraordinary. Yeah. So all of you. Surprises in there as well. Jean, I should say.
Yeah.
And John, actually. And yeah, beautiful work, Amanda. Thanks very much, all of you. I also would like to acknowledge the first people of this country, and especially the elders of the Turrbal and Yagara people who've always lived here. Thank them for the great blessing of sharing this place with them. And welcome everyone to this conversation with Emily, author of this extraordinary book, The Islands. It's very seldom that a debut novel, a debut Australian novel anyway, sort of arrives to the kind of excitement that has accompanied The Islands. We've seen the reviews in various places lately. You picked up the buzz. This is so embarrassing, terribly, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then you get writers like Tegan Bennett Daylight, Meryl Day, Jacques Sarong, Robert Drew, Lavish and Fraser. Then you know you're onto something special. And it is, it's very special. So fabulous to have you here, Emily. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me. This is my first live event, since the book was published, so very exciting.
Very gentle. None of us roughhousing Brisbane, so it's not. So Emily's going to do a short reading for us before we kick off any questions. So I'd really like you all to get a feel of what this beautiful book is like. It's just that she's chosen to do it a short rather than a longer reading. But we might have to do more later if there's time.
I'm going to read from the third chapter of the book. Alva Saari, the young wife of Onni, the crayfisherman, has just arrived back on the island with a 4-week-old baby, much to Onni's surprise. They begin to settle into life on the islands together. Onni and Alva fell easily into domestic life on the islands. While Alva had been in Geraldton with Hilda that first month, Onni had built the sauna. A warmth spread out inside of her when he presented it. "Makes sense out here," he said, with fresh water being scarce. But Alva understood it was a gift for her, even if he would not admit it. From then on, they used the sauna instead of the bucket bath, sweating out their day's work before briefly splashing their naked bodies with a ladle of fresh water. Oh, how it all shouted to Alva of home. The hot, dry air roaring up her nostrils whenever she took a breath, the sweat gathering on her hairline and slippery on her thighs, the dark, relaxing quiet. Afterwards, she would wash little baby Hilda in the bucket of water, adding a splash of hot from the stove, and then the clothes. When Onni went out fishing, Alva cooked, watched over Hilda and decorated the tin hut. She'd collected a discarded float, a sun-bleached Boris old thing, and fed fisherman's rope through the centre, knotting 2 lures and a gnarled fish hook to the end. When she was finished, she hung it from the rafters. Yes, the hut was slowly finding its character. Each day, Alva would walk the rocky perimeter of Little Rat with Hilda wrapped tight and slung across her chest. She scanned the ground, looking for small treasures, a knob of dried coral to sit on the windowsill, a roe abalone shell in which to place the soap, a splinter of driftwood, its surface rubbed smooth by the water, on which she wrote, "Little Rat Island, April 1960, before putting it next to the coral fragment. Now Alva stood in the doorway of the camp, looking out at the skewed jetty and the scrappy islands beyond. She had a broom in her hand and leaned her weight against its long handle. Hilda lay in a makeshift crib just inside the door, clenching and unclenching her tiny fists. The islands were a poor excuse for a home, thought Alva, as she took in the view of the archipelago. To think that people had looked at them and thought, yes, these should do just fine. She looked about and shook her head in wonder, her watery blue eyes giving away her overwhelming delight. How glad she was to be here. We feel like strangers in that big, hot, dusty country, Petra had said when Alva told her about the terror of birth and those quiet, solitary weeks spent in Geraldton. These islands, these we can make our own. Alva smiled, feeling the sun crisp and warm on her bare arms. She was as happy as she would ever be. Then, typically, her Aunt Eva's old proverb intruded. "Itku pitkästä ilosta," cry after a long happiness. She swept her superstitions away, bringing the broom across the timber floor and boldly pushing the dust out the door. Quietly, Alva crooned a lullaby. Tu, 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 papiruga, mistä Hilda tiesi tulla. Kalevala. Roll, 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 cigarette. Where did Hilda know to come from? She sang the silly words as much to herself as to her daughter. A bird song for this parallel universe, somewhere between land and water.
Lots more of that kind of thing. So this is a novel in which setting is in itself a major character. When we talk about that in writing, it really is truly a character. It's very remote. The Brugman, Abrolhos Islands off the coast of West Australia. Very few Australians have been, or maybe even heard of them. Show of hands, how many people know about these islands or know where they are? Okay, a few of us. Yeah. Yeah. I've had to consult a couple of friends, one of who's in the audience tonight, about what they look like. So I thought I'd get an idea in my head about exactly what they were like. A couple of friends have already been there, lucky them. But I want you to take us there yourself and Emily, and tell us what it was like living in those islands, what it looked like to them, to Alva and Onni, and how different it is now. Because I'm going to talk about that later. I'm sure you've been researching up there. But yeah, can you take us there?
Yeah. Am I holding the microphone at the right spot?
Just me, if you both are very close to your mouth, you're right.
Maybe I had gone too close.
No.
So I visited the islands for the first time, first and only time in 2016 with my mum. She hadn't been back since she was 9 years old, so it was a very special trip that we took together. And you get a 6-seater plane across from Geraldton to the island of Big Rat, and it's a very steep descent down to a gravel runway. The islands are incredibly stark. It's a stark and treeless place. These are coral islands, 60 kilometres from the mainland. All you see is tin shacks and sort of skewed jetties coming off them. I think it would have been such a remote place in the late 50s when my grandparents arrived there and when characters of Alva and Onni arrived there. It would have been an 8-hour trip by boat. And once you were there, you were staying there, usually for the season. And at that time, it was the beginning of the burgeoning cray industry there, and it was, I guess, the community kind of built up over sort of the years of the 60s and 70s, and it was a bustling community for a time. Nowadays, because the industry has changed, a lot of the shacks that remain on the islands are actually empty. So on Little Rat, there are, I think, 3 families still fishing from that island, where in the days that my grandparents were there would have been 20 or so families going there every season and fishing from there.
So no amenities.
So everything has to be carted out on the carrier boat still today. So you have to bring all the water out, all the food out, apart from the fish that you catch. If you want to talk about amenities, the toilets were little sort of like drop loos built out of the edge of the island with a hole.
Yeah. And so this is what Alva would have been dealing with a baby, and yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yet it was on the islands that she sort of finds her community and she feels a sense of belonging for a time. And so despite the remoteness and the roughness compared to Geraldton, this is where she wants to be.
And why? Why compared to Geraldton? What was it about Geraldton she did that was so different?
I think it was that she just felt this real sense of isolation there. uh,
In
all
Geraldton.
in Geraldton.
Oh, ironic, yeah, isn't how isolated they are.
Her small community that she had found, her small group of Finnish friends and Finnish crayfishers were all on the islands, and she felt alone on the mainland.
It does to me feel like it's like when you go, it's another country. It's almost not even Australia. And there's a line in the book where you talk about when they're first going over. There's an imaginary line drawn in water where you left it all behind, as the fisherman said. Halfway across the deep trough, you went to another universe. So for them, it was like crossing a line.
Yeah, and I think it still is for many of the fishermen and their families that fish there today. I went to the islands in 2016 and I did a few interviews. We were able to stay on the island for 5 days in a fisherman's shack on the island of Little Rat, just a little few doors down from where my grandparents' shack or camp used to be, camp. And we were staying with a descendant of another Finnish fishing family, and he told me about this parallel line.
All right.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Well, I guess just even coming from Finland to Australia must have felt like coming to another universe in itself, such different landscape. But Finland is islanded too, so perhaps that was a sense of
Finland is islanded too, and Finland is also, especially in the winter, its vast whiteness and of the snow and the vast blueness of the sky for that very short period each day. And I suppose some of those colours are the same colours of the Abrolhos Island landscape as well.
what brought you to this story in the first place?
So the islands have always existed in my family's kind of collective memory. I don't so much remember hearing stories about the islands, but perhaps I saw the photos and I knew sort of deep within myself that this was this place and time when my grandmother especially, and also my mum and her sisters, were their happiest, as a family unit. And so I think the landscapes of our family's past, they kind of imprint themselves on us in some way. And at a point in our lives, we want to go back and explore them, even if we have never lived in those places. And so this was what the islands were for me.
Did it feel like, did you have to go to family to say you wanted to write this story? Was there any sense of transgression in it because of some of the sadnesses attached to it?
Well, I wouldn't say it was so much sadnesses, but happinesses attached to it. And this was a novel which was 7 years in the making. And when I first started writing it, it was a uni project, honours project. So I didn't know whether it would ever become a published book, and it kind of didn't matter. Either way, my grandmother had already passed away. My grandfather always knew that I was working on this, and he would, there was always a bit of a language barrier between us, but with the help of my mum and my aunties, I would ask him questions, and he was always enthusiastic in being part of these sort of unofficial interviews. And same with my aunties. There was I never really got the feeling that, the family didn't want me to do it.
So it wasn't anything that they wanted to hide or keep.
No, but this is a fictionalized tale, and the characters, they are grounded in my family members and in myself, but the things that take place in the book didn't necessarily happen to my family.
Sometimes though, when you're writing those things, family can be even more upset because embroidered things a little. I was thinking that it really wasn't a terribly comfortable life on those islands, especially in those days. But then they haven't come from a comfortable life at home either. Have they? We were talking about this earlier. In the book, Alva says, or memorably thinks to herself at one stage, where she came from, happiness was not necessarily something one was entitled to or expected to find. And it's a line, it's a line I want, well, that's a line I want to forgive anyway, because it does draw this indelible line between then and now, doesn't it? I mean, our lives these days are based around happiness, especially very young. It's what they feel is their entitlement, happiness, or that's what they seek. There's Alva saying, we didn't have it at home, I don't expect to have it now.
Yeah, I think in her experience and in that era, she was growing up in a very sort of tumultuous time in the world, and she was growing up in a very poor household. She's what you call a Elaine or a cottager. And she's also growing up in a Lutheran household. And, you know, I think that this idea of sort of accepting suffering is really ingrained in that outlook.
Yeah, and hence the stoicism, really. Yeah, absolutely. There's this lovely joke. Susan Wyndham was a wonderful reviewer here in Australia, said in the review of this book, she was talking about the stoicism and used the joke that there was once a Finn who loved his wife so much she almost told him. Very Finnish, I think.
Very Finnish, but also seems to resonate across, you know, so.
Let's look at the story. Now, it kicks off when Onni's brother disappears at sea. And he, of course, Onni at the time is working deep in the mines on the mainland, but of course comes to the island to look for his brother. You pick it up from there.
Yeah, so Onni has taken a similar migratory route to other Finns that have come before him. These are sort of young working class men who have come to Australia looking for an economic opportunity and a little bit of an adventure. And he has been mining in a lead mine in Northampton. Another area that Finns went to was Mount Isa. So Onni is drawn to the islands when his brother goes missing out there, and he joins the search party. And I mean, it happens very early on in the book, so I don't think it's a spoiler, but spoiler?
Don't worry.
No.
No, it won't be a spoiler.
Anyway, Onni ends up taking over his brother's camp and cray license and bringing Alva out, and they spend their first season on the Abrolhos Islands, and Onni slowly goes about learning the trade of crayfishing. Soon they have their daughter, Hilda, and what we get is I've written the book in kind of each chapter kind of jumps into another perspective. And so in chapter 2, we are taken into Alva's perspective. And this is where I read from earlier. And so Alva has this kind of time on her own in Geraldton before she gets back out onto the islands and takes the baby Hilda with her. After this, we meet Hilda as well and hear about the child's experience of the islands and the freedom, the roaming freedom that experience.
It's actually a really beautiful way to structure something. And you say in the back of the book that you pay tribute to Thea Astley, who used such a structure in Drylands, and Elizabeth Stroud and Olive Kitteridge. It's kind of like a time-lapse kind of a structure, isn't it? So you meet the character again a little while further on.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are small details as well that kind of link different chapters. And so it has that, I guess, the satisfaction that you get from a novel that maybe you don't always have from a short story, you know, all of this kind of like linking back into something that you've heard before.
It's really difficult to do. Look difficult to read. I mean, it doesn't know it read as if it was effortless, but I mean, like, as a writer, I looked at it and thought, wow, I'm not sure about the patience.
But I'm sure you do that in novels. It was definitely something that I learned along the way. And when I started writing this book, I didn't really know what the structure would be in the long run. It began as a collection of interlinked short stories, and I thought maybe it would be something a little bit more like The Turning, if you know what I mean. And which are short stories that there are linkages, but they're not so clear. And then some stories seem completely separate to others. And then when I read Drylands by Thea Astley and Olive Kitteridge at this kind of precise moment that I needed to read them, because at that time I was sort of confused about whether I was writing a collection of short stories or a novel, and those books gave me the permission to write something that was in between.
Sometimes that happens in the right life, doesn't it? Yeah, just when you need it, it comes along. One of the things that really sustains the people and the book actually are on the islands and on the mainland are the Finnish traditions that are kept. The food and the celebrations and the rituals and the songs in summer and in winter. Can you tell us a little about those? They're very charming and they feel very familiar to me as well.
Well, these are kind of rituals or traditions that I've grown up with as the grandchild of Finns. And so some of the things that they continue to do on the islands in the mainland, for one, is the sauna. They also have the midsummer celebration in June every year. And
can you tell us about that?
So it was sort of originally, it kind of comes from a celebration of like the thunder god. And so it's got pagan roots, I suppose. And each year it's basically just like a big party with singing and drinking vodka. And and another tradition that you find in the book is the melting of the lead on New Year's Eve. And this is something that my family always did with my grandpa when he was alive. And so on New Year's Eve, everyone gathers together. And they don't use lead anymore. I think they use tin because that's not very good for you. And anyway, traditionally lead is melted on a ladle over a flame, and then it's tipped into a bucket of cold water, and it freezes into a position or into a shape, and you get it out. Each person gets one, and it is supposed to tell you what's in store for you in the year to come. They are these like very kind of strange gnarled shapes that are pretty difficult to interpret, but maybe that, that's perfect.
But these sustain them, don't they, in the tougher times? So they still have these traditions and they're very strong.
Yeah, of course, I think they do. Yeah.
Also wanted to talk about the unpronounceable for me, Kalevala, which is Finland's epic poem. Yeah. And this has got a place in the story as well. Can you talk about how that fits in?
Yeah, sure. So the Kalevala is an epic poem which was originally an oral tradition in Finland, stories passed down through song, and eventually they were written down I think in the sort of early to mid 19th century. these days it's considered Finland's national folklore, I suppose. And in the book, the character of Onni kind of contemplates a particular motif from within the folk tale throughout the book. And that motif is the sampo. Sampo is an indeterminate object which grinds flour, salt and money, and it brings prosperity and abundance to the community who have it. And in the folk tales, it's fought over by two warring communities and is eventually lost in the sea. And when Onni arrives on the islands, one of the old fishermen says about his brother, Nalle thought he had found it out there on the reef. And he's talking about the crayfish, which offer prosperity or the possibility of prosperity, riches and abundance to the crayfishermen. But also the possibility of downfall. And so Onni takes this and it becomes his preoccupation, I suppose, throughout his life. What is the sampo? How does one attain it? And I'll leave it at that.
I think every culture's got their version of that.
Yeah. And I think there are parallels between, I think there's something called the Horn of Plenty in Greek and Roman mythology.
Before we tie up, I just wanted to mention, do you know about this, Emily, that I found this in some obscure place that I'm researching the interview tonight, that the word Abrolhos actually means, when it comes from the Dutch, it means open your eyes, or some such.
Yeah, interestingly, throughout my research, I found two meanings for the word Abrolhos. One was open your eyes, and the other was spiked obstructions.
Yeah.
And
maybe open your eyes to the spike. There's lots of binkies. Goodness. Look, you're all going to absolutely love this book. Characters, setting, culture, everything. I love the name One-Eyed Esco, Tall Tommy, Latvian Igor. These are the people who people the book and the language as well. And it's written in this gorgeous language. The rhythm of the Scandinavian languages really comes through in the writing of this book. Thank you for writing it. We've got time for questions.
We do. We've got a few minutes. Yeah.
Excellent.
thank you,
Thank you. It's like, honestly, I have read part of this book, and it's fantastic. And I've read a lot of debut fiction, which has promise, and you can see that the author will grow. But it feels like this is an author who has grown. It's a really beautiful piece of work, and I really encourage you to read it because it's the pace of it is beautiful and the language is beautiful. It's really great. So thank you for this session. Does anyone have any questions here or online? Yes, we've got Miranda and Sally. So Sally, do you want to ask first?
Just when you went back to the islands with the couple, we always think back on places in that past.
The question was, sorry for the Zoom audience who can't hear that, how did your mum feel going back to the islands?
Well, I think that she felt quite emotional, especially as we kind of landed there and had a look around. I think she felt the presence of her mum. And we could see the little camp where they used to live during that season. I think it took her back to her childhood, and she could remember viscerally, very small details about the island. The rocky section over there and the funny spongy stuff on the rocks over there and all those kinds of things. But, at the same time, I'm sure she felt like it wasn't her place anymore because we were guests of another fishing family and we would be there for 5 days and then we would have to leave. Yeah.
It's a bittersweetness, isn't it? Randy.
Thank you for visiting us. Thank you for doing that before. I was wondering, how did you separate out the memoir side of your like what you know of the arts versus what you made up? Because I find that actually quite hard. And I was talking to my mum who's trying to write memoir, and I was saying, oh, well, maybe we should fictionalise it, and then sometimes that's hard. So how did you go about that? Was that difficult?
So questions about separation of what's real and what's fictional, and how did you go about that kind of separation?
I think it's easier for me in a way because I'm writing about another era. I mean, you do too, Randy, but the experiences of the people I write about are not my own experiences. And so it can't be a memoir for me. I guess I could be writing the true story of my family. I think what I do.
I just think sometimes, you know, how you get stuck in that real story.
Yeah.
It's hard to like branch out of it. So
Yeah. I think what I did for this story was I used the real people to as a sort of a jumping off point for who my characters are. Whereas a lot of the things that take place, they're either imagined or they have been told by another fishing family. You know, they're kind of like little folk tales from the islands that people remember and talk about. And, you know, there's like one chapter in this book which is from the perspective of the grandchild. And that is, you know, probably as close to my experience as possible. But, you know, I wrote that child's relationship with her grandparents as an idealistic version of what I kind of wish that my relationship could have been, because I didn't have the language to talk to them and get to know them properly. But the way that I write is kind of, it's grounded in the people that I know, and then I let, you know, other stories and anecdotes kind of feed into the story, and maybe that's the way it finds its, the fictionalized part. I don't know.
that's right.
There's a question here and then one from Zoom.
A sauna in Lismore.
Do you have a sauna in Lismore?
I've had Finnish friends in New Farm here. They had to have a sauna. I've visited them on their island in Finland. I had to stay in the sauna house. So
I don't have a sauna. I would love to have a sauna, and I hope to one day, when I hopefully own a house, to build a sauna.
But it's more than just a sweat house, isn't it? It's Finnish culture.
Yeah, it is. It's a place where, you know, you go and spend quiet time with family, but also with friends. Like you might have little women's sauna, and yeah, it has a special place in the culture.
So a question from Jacqueline on Zoom, who asks, what is the origin of the name Little Rat Island?
So Little Rat and Big Rat, which are next to each other on the Abrolhos, they got their names from, they had rat infestations on them at a certain time, and people don't really know why that is, but they think it's probably that rats made their way onto those islands from ships, boats and shipwrecks.
Of course, the Abrolhos is famous for Batavia and other shipwrecks. That's what we learned in primary school. That's how we know the name of Abrolhos. Can I ask one question? Has there been some feedback from the family? How's the family received the book?
Well, my mum and my auntie, well, they both read various versions of the manuscript, but they have reread the finished book and they both say that they just cry all the way through.
That's what we want.
It's wonderful. One more question here.
It's not a question, I just finished reading it today, my mother was finished. I still cry when I think of old one.
Oh. Very emotional connection to the book. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that you have kind of hooked onto something. There are, they're not a massive Finnish community in Brisbane, but I'm sure that the people who are from that culture will be desperate to kind of see themselves reflected in books. I know Slovenian people I've been contacted by some Slovenes who just felt so isolated before reading something about their culture. I think it's a wonderful thing that you've done, and I'm pretty sure this is the beginning of a very big life that this book will have. And I hope you get lots of letters from people who cry as they read it. I really do. So everybody, I think that we should now consider your first public event a success. So thank you for coming here, Emily. Welcome. Thanks to Ms. Olsson again for your support. So what we're going to do is we're going to move Emily inside now. There's a signing table that we set up near the front of the shop, and you can come and just chat to Emily there and talk a bit more about the book. Thank you.
We'll move Emily out first before we mob her.